The sun was a hammer, and the Arizona desert was its anvil. In the year 1883, a woman named Elara Vance was walking through this godless furnace, her own past a ghost at her heels. She wasn't looking for a fight or for redemption. She was looking for solitude. But destiny out here in the dust and the heat has a cruel sense of humor. She found a man clinging to life by a thread, a Lakota warrior with a bullet in his side. In an act of defiance against the brutal land itself, she chose to save him. She dragged him day after grueling day across an unforgiving hellscape fighting for his life, never knowing that the man she was saving was the most wanted outlaw in the territory and the son of the very man hunting them. The heat was a physical presence. It pressed down from a bleached white sky, radiated up from the cracked ochre earth, and shimmered in waves that distorted the horizon into a watery nightmare. For 3 days, Elara Vance had seen nothing but skeletal saguaros, their arms raised in surrender to the sun, and the occasional dust devil dancing itself to death in the distance. She was alone by choice. The fire in St. Louis that had claimed her parents and her life's work, a carefully curated collection of botanical sketches, had burned away everything but the woman herself. So she had walked west away from the cinders and the ghosts, seeking a silence so profound it might finally quiet the screaming in her own head. Her water was low, her lips were cracked, and the skin on her face felt as tight as a drum. She was rationing her hope as carefully as her water. It was then that she saw it, not a mirage, but a smudge of darkness against the rocks of a low butte. Vultures. They circled with a patience that was profoundly unsettling, black specks riding the thermal currents. Common sense, what little she had left, told her to walk on. Trouble found people in the desert, and it usually wore a dead man's face. But a flicker of the woman she used to be, the curious botanist, the doctor's daughter, urged her forward. He was half buried in the rust-colored sand, as if the desert itself were trying to swallow him. He was Lakota. That much was clear from the high cheekbones and the raven-black hair matted with blood and dust. He wore buckskin trousers and a torn linen shirt that was stained a terrible dark crimson around his ribs. His chest rose and fell in shallow, ragged breaths. He was young, perhaps no older than 25, but the lines of pain around his eyes made him look ancient. A cult peacemaker lay a few feet from his outstretched hand, half swallowed by the sand. Elara knelt, her knees sinking into the hot grit. The wound was bad. A gunshot clean through the side. It was festering in the heat, the edges of it angry and red. He was burning with fever, his skin radiating a dry, punishing heat that had nothing to do with the sun above. He muttered something in a language she didn't understand. His voice, a dry rasp like stones scraping together. She looked at the vast, empty expanse around them. Leaving him was a death sentence. Taking him with her felt like signing her own. Her supplies were meant for one. He was a stranger, an Indian, which in this part of the territory made him a target by default. Helping him would be inviting a world of trouble she had journeyed so far to escape. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, a calm, steady presence from a world of ash. You don't turn your back on suffering, Elara. Not ever. It's the one law that God and man should agree on. With a sigh that turned to grit in her throat, she made her choice. She cleaned the wound as best she could with the last of her clean water and a strip of cloth torn from her petticoat. She found the exit wound ragged, but at least the bullet wasn't still inside him. She packed it with the crushed leaves of a creosote bush, a trick a friendly Apache woman had taught her on the trail to stave off infection. He groaned, his body tensing, but he didn't wake. Now came the impossible part. She couldn't carry him. She fashioned a travois from 2 long, sturdy ribs of a dead saguaro, and her own bedroll lashing them together with leather cordage. It was clumsy, heavy work. The sun beat down, and sweat dripped into her eyes, stinging them. She managed to roll him onto the crude sledge. He was heavier than he looked, a dead weight of muscle and bone. She looped the pulling ropes over her shoulders, the coarse fibre digging into her skin. Taking a deep breath, she leaned into the weight and pulled. The travois scraped across the rock and sand. It was like dragging an anchor. Every step was a battle. Her muscles screamed, her lungs burned, and her mind shrieked at her to stop, to abandon this foolish, suicidal act of mercy. But she didn't stop. As the sun began to bleed across the western sky, painting the clouds in hues of blood and fire, Ilara Vance dragged the Gunshot Lakota through the burning desert. She didn't know his name, his crime, or his people. She only knew the weight of him behind her, and the rhythm of his shallow breaths, a fragile metronome, counting down the seconds they had left. She was running from ghosts, only to find herself tethered to a dying man, pulling him toward a horizon that promised nothing but more of the same endless, brutal light. The days blurred into one long, continuous ordeal. The desert was a relentless adversary, and Ilara fought it with a stubbornness born of grief and a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a year purpose. The routine was brutal. Walk from the pre-dawn grey until the sun became unbearable. Find shelter from the midday furnace under a rock overhang or in the sparse shade of a palo verde tree. Walk again as the afternoon heat softened into the twilight glow. The nights were a reprieve from the heat, but brought a different kind of chill, a cold that seeped into the bones and the unnerving sounds of unseen creatures. Her world shrank to the immediate, the essential, the burning in her shoulders from the travois ropes, the gnawing emptiness in her stomach, the precious, sloshing sound of the last half-canteen of water, and the man. He drifted in and out of consciousness. In his delirium he spoke, sometimes in his native tongue, a river of guttural flowing sounds, other times in perfect unaccented English. He cried out names Tashunke and Jedediah. He mumbled of shadows and a stolen sky, of a silver star on a leather vest. They were fractured pieces of a life she couldn't comprehend, the ramblings of a fevered mind. On the second day of their journey, she found a small seep, a patch of damp earth, where a trickle of water, brackish and tasting of minerals, collected in a shallow rock basin. It was a miracle. She drank until her stomach ached, then painstakingly filtered the rest through a piece of cloth into her canteen. She dribbled water onto the man's cracked lips and used it to cool his fevered brow. His eyes flickered open. They weren't the dark, flat eyes she expected. They were a startling hazel, flecked with gold, and for a moment they were clear and focused. He looked at her at the travois, at the endless expanse of desert around them. Why, he rasped his voice, barely a whisper. Ilara paused, her hand hovering over his forehead. "You are dying," she said simply, as if it were the only answer that mattered. A flicker of something gratitude confusion passed through his eyes before the fever pulled him under again. That night, as a sliver of moon hung in the star-dusted sky, a rattlesnake slithered towards their camp, drawn by the scent of 2 living, breathing creatures. Ilara saw the flicker of movement just in time. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands were steady. She grabbed a rock, heavy and sure in her palm, and with a desperate cry, she brought it down on the snake's head, just behind the eyes. The act left her shaking, not with fear, but with a raw, primal surge of adrenaline. She had not just survived. She had protected. She had defended them. She skinned the snake with her small utility knife, the way her father had taught her on their camping trips in the Ozarks so long ago. She cooked the meat over a small, smokeless fire of dried mesquite wood. It was tough and stringy, but it was protein fuel for the furnace of her body. When the Lakota man stirred again, his eyes briefly lucid, she offered him a small piece. He chewed it slowly, painfully, but he ate. "Coda," he whispered, his eyes closing again. "Is that your name?" she asked the sleeping man. There was no reply. Coda. It was something to call him a handle for the heavy burden she dragged behind her. Their bond was forged in this shared crucible, a silent partnership of survival. She was his legs, his will, his protector. He was her purpose, the anchor that kept her from simply lying down and letting the desert claim her, as it had almost claimed him. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he began to heal. The fever receded, leaving him weak but clear-headed for longer stretches. The wound, thanks to her diligent cleaning and the creosote poultices, began to close, the angry red softening to a healing pink. He started to speak more. He told her his name was Coda. He never offered a family name. He spoke of the stars as if they were old friends, pointing out the warrior and the turtle in the night sky. He showed her how to find water by watching the flight of doves in the morning. He knew the desert not as an enemy to be conquered, but as a living thing to be understood. She found herself watching him, the way his brow furrowed when he was in pain, the quiet dignity in his gaze even when he was at his most vulnerable. There was a deep sadness in him, a sorrow that the fever hadn't been able to burn away. He was a man carrying a weight far heavier than his own wounded body. One afternoon, as they rested, he looked at her hands raw and blistered from the travois ropes. He reached out with a trembling hand and lightly touched her wrist. "You have the spirit of a bison," he said, his voice stronger now. "You do not stop. You just keep walking." Ilara pulled her hand back, unnerved by the sudden intimacy. "Someone has to," she said, her voice rough. "Why me?" he asked, his hazel eyes searching hers. "A white woman. An Indian. The world says we should be enemies." "The world isn't here, Coda," she replied, looking out at the horizon. "Out here there's only the living and the dead. I chose to keep you on this side of the line." He was silent for a long time after that. As she prepared to move on, she saw him looking at his own hands, then back at her, a new and unreadable expression on his face. The connection between them was no longer just about survival. It was something deeper, something more complicated, and for the first time since St. Louis, Ilara Vance felt a tremor of fear that had nothing to do with the desert. After a week that felt like a lifetime, the character of the land began to change. The endless flat expanse of the deep desert gave way to rolling hills dotted with juniper and hardy scrub oak. They were leaving the furnace and entering the territory's populated fringes. They saw a dust trail in the distance, the first sign of another human being since Ilara had found Coda. Coda was now strong enough to walk for short periods, leaning on a sturdy branch for support. The travois was abandoned, a monument to their ordeal left behind in the wilderness. Though he was still weak, his presence beside her, rather than behind her, changed the dynamic entirely. They were no longer rescuer and victim. They were partners. Their supplies were gone. The last of the snake meat had been eaten days ago, and their canteen held only a few warm, stale mouthfuls of water. They needed a town, or at least a trading post. Coda, with his innate sense of direction, pointed them toward a notch in the distant hills. "Agua Dulce," he said. "Sweet water. There is a spring and a man who trades there. Eli Patterson. He is fair." Agua Dulce wasn't a town. It was a collection of 3 adobe buildings huddled around a cottonwood-shaded spring, a trading post, a small livery, and a cantina whose paint was peeling off in sun-baked sheets. It was a place for travelers to water their horses and wet their whistles before moving on. Ilara felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. "Maybe I should go in alone," she suggested. "They'll be less suspicious of a woman by herself." Coda's jaw tightened. He knew what she meant. A white woman traveling with an Indian would invite questions, dangerous questions. Be careful, Ilara. Eli is a good man, but his customers are not always. He retreated into the shade of the rocks, overlooking the post, his silhouette blending into the shadows. Ilara smoothed her torn and dusty dress, trying to make herself look like a weary traveler, and not a half-wild woman who just clawed her way out of hell. She walked into the cool dimness of the trading post. It smelled of leather coffee and chewing tobacco. A portly man with a magnificent greying mustache stood behind the counter, polishing a glass. This had to be Eli Patterson. 2 dusty-looking cowboys were hunched over the counter at the far end, nursing bottles of whiskey. They glanced up as she entered their eyes, lingering on her with a casual insolence that made her skin crawl. She ignored them and approached the counter. "Afternoon," Eli said, his voice a friendly baritone. "Long walk." "You could say that," Ilara replied, forcing a smile. "I need water, some flour, bacon, and coffee, and any medical supplies you might have. Bandages, carbolic acid if you have it." Eli's friendly eyes grew sharp with professional curiosity. "Trouble on the trail, my brother? A fall from his horse. He's resting up in the hills." It was a clumsy lie, but the best she could come up with. The storekeeper nodded slowly, gathering her items. As he turned his back, her eyes scanned the room. And then she saw it. Nailed to a wooden support beam next to a notice about livestock auctions was a wanted poster. The paper was fresh, the ink dark. The sketch was crude, as they always were, but it was unmistakably the man she had just left in the hills. The high cheekbones, the intense eyes, the strong jaw. Beneath the drawing, the words struck her like a physical blow. Wanted dead or alive. $500 reward. Caleb Kane for the robbery of the Tucson stage and the murder of Deputy Miller, known to associate with hostile Lakota. Considered armed and extremely dangerous. Authorized by Jedediah, Kane Sheriff, Redemption County. Ilara's breath caught in her throat. Her blood ran cold. Caleb Kane, not Coda, and the name of the authorizing sheriff, Jedediah Kane, the name he had cried out in his fever. A son with the same last name as the sheriff hunting him. It made no sense. It made a terrifying kind of sense. One of the cowboys at the end of the bar let out a low whistle. That's the one, ain't it? Jedediah's boy, the Injun one. Heard the sheriff is tearing the territory apart looking for him. Says he'll bring him in himself. More like bring him in a pine box, his friend slurred. Ain't no coming back from killing a lawman. Even for the sheriff's son. Especially not for his pet savage. The words hit Ilara one by one, each a poisoned dart. Sheriff's son, Injun one, pet savage. Her mind reeled. The man she had saved, the man whose quiet dignity had earned her respect, was a wanted murderer, an outlaw, and the son of the lawman sworn to bring him to justice. She had been a fool. She had risked her life for a killer. Her hands trembled as she paid Eli her movements, stiff and robotic. She gathered the supplies, her mind a maelstrom of betrayal and fear. She had to get away. She had to leave him. Now. She walked out of the trading post, her legs unsteady. She didn't go back to the rocks. She started walking down the trail away from Agua Dulce, away from him, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. Every instinct screamed at her to run and never look back. She had fulfilled her duty. She had saved his life. She owed him nothing more. She walked for a quarter of a mile, the bag of supplies digging into her shoulder. The desert stretched out before her, vast and empty again. But it was no longer a place of solitude. It was a place of lies. With a cry of frustration, she stopped, dropping the bag in the dust. She couldn't do it. She couldn't just leave him. Was he a murderer, or was there more to the story? The man who taught her how to read the stars, the man with the sad, hazel eyes. Could he truly be the cold-blooded killer on that poster? She turned around and stormed back towards the rocks, her fear now eclipsed by a burning, furious need for the truth. She found him where she had left him. He stood up as she approached, a question in his eyes. "Your name isn't Coda, is it?" she said, her voice shaking with barely controlled rage. She threw the wanted poster at his feet. It landed in the dust between them. "It's Caleb. Caleb Kane." He looked down at the paper, then back up at her. His face was a mask of stone, but she saw the flicker of pain in his eyes. He didn't deny it. "You're an outlaw." She spat the word, tasting like poison. "A murderer. You let me risk my life for you. You let me care for you." All of it was a lie. "Not all of it," he said, his voice low and strained. "Wanted for the murder of a deputy," she shouted, pointing a trembling finger at the poster. "Did you do it? Did you kill him?" Caleb Kane looked at her, and for the first time, she saw the full weight of the storm raging inside him. His jaw was clenched, his hands balled into fists at his sides. "It's not that simple, Ilara." "It seems very simple to me," she cried. "You're either a murderer or you're not. So tell me, Caleb, which is it?" He held her gaze, his own eyes filled with a desperate plea for understanding that warred with years of guarded secrets. "Yes," he finally said the word, dropping like a stone in the suffocating silence. "I killed him." The confession hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Ilara felt the last of her resolve crumble, replaced by a cold, bitter certainty. She had been a fool, a sentimental idiot who had projected nobility onto a common killer. "Get away from me," she whispered, taking a step back. "I saved your life. I should have left you for the vultures." "Ilara, wait," Caleb pleaded, taking a hesitant step toward her. His limp was more pronounced, as if the weight of his admission was pressing on his wounded side. "You heard the charge. Now hear the story. I'm not interested in the story of a man who shoots lawmen in the back." She retorted, her voice hard. "He wasn't shot in the back," Caleb said, his voice ringing with a sudden fierce intensity. "And he was more than a lawman. Deputy Miller was a monster wearing a badge, and Sheriff Jedediah Kane, he's my father." That stopped her. She stared at him, bewildered. "Your father is the one hunting you, the one who signed your death warrant." Caleb let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "It's complicated." He gestured to a flat rock. "Please. 5 minutes. I owe you that much. I owe you everything." Hesitantly, driven by a sliver of morbid curiosity she couldn't extinguish, she sat. Caleb remained standing, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains, as he began to speak, not just telling a story, but unburdening a lifetime of conflict. "I am not Lakota by birth," he began, the word seeming to cost him dearly. "My people were Sikangu from up north. When I was a baby, maybe a year old, a cavalry troop hit our winter camp. They called it a battle. My people called it a massacre. They killed everyone. My mother, my father. Everyone." He paused, swallowing hard. Jedediah Kane was a young deputy with the troop. He wasn't like the others. He found me wrapped in a bison calf robe, hidden beneath my mother's body. He said he saw the life go out of her eyes as she looked at him, begging him to save me. So he did. He gave me an American name, Caleb, and raised me as his own son. Ilara listened, stunned into silence. The violent, chaotic image of a massacre felt a world away from the quiet, stoic man before her. Jedediah was a good father. Caleb continued, his voice softening. He taught me to read and write, to shoot, to ride. He taught me about the law. He gave me a home, a name. But he couldn't change what was in my blood. Every summer, he would let me spend time with the people of my mother's cousins, a small Lakota band that had settled south. He wanted me to know both sides of myself. He thought I could be a bridge between two worlds. Caleb looked down at his hands. But a bridge gets walked on from both sides. To the white folk in redemption, I was always the sheriff's Indian boy. A curiosity. A pet. To some of the Lakota, I was Washichu, a white man, in a red man's skin, tainted by the world of the law that had taken so much from them. He finally met her eyes, and the pain in them was raw. I lived my whole life on that bridge, Ilara, belonging nowhere. What does this have to do with Deputy Miller? She asked, her voice softer now. Everything, he said. A railroad baron, a man named Silas Croft, wants the land the Lakota band is settled on. It has a river running through it. He's been trying to drive them out for years. Deputy Miller was on his payroll. He and his men would ride through the settlement, harass the women, steal horses, looking for any excuse to start a fight they could call an uprising. His voice grew low and dangerous. 2 weeks ago, they went too far. Miller cornered a young woman, Shining Flower. He hurt her. Her brother, a boy of 16, named Little Hawk, tried to stop him. Miller beat him half to death. Caleb's fists clenched. I rode out there. I found Little Hawk bleeding in the dust. I went after Miller. It wasn't a robbery. The stagecoach was carrying Croft's payroll, and Miller was guarding it. I wasn't after the money. I was after him. I called him out, face to face. He drew on me. I was faster. The simple, brutal calculus of the West. He drew on me. I was faster. So you killed him, Ilara stated the accusation, gone from her voice, replaced by a dawning understanding. I did. Caleb affirmed, his gaze unflinching. I did it to answer for what he did to Shining Flower and her brother. I did it because my father's law was protecting him instead of them. I chose a side, Ilara. I finally got off the bridge. And the stage drivers, they'll say whatever Silas Croft pays them to say. A simple gunfight becomes a robbery and a cold-blooded murder. It all clicked into place. The name Jedediah cried out in his fever, not a curse, but the name of his father. His knowledge of both worlds, the deep abiding sadness in him. He was a man torn in two, who had finally been forced to stitch himself together, even if the act made him an outlaw. And your father? She asked quietly. Sheriff Kane. Why would he sign the warrant? Caleb's expression was a mixture of pain and love. Because he is Jedediah Kane. The law is his God. It's all he has. He believes in it even when it's broken, even when it's wrong. He will hunt me because the law says he must. He signed that poster with a broken heart, I guarantee you. He is hoping, praying that he finds me before a bounty hunter's bullet does. He wants to bring me in to give me a trial. He knows I can't win. It's his way of trying to save my life, even if it means putting me in a cage. Ilara looked from the wanted poster in the dust to the man standing before her. He was not the simple murderer she had feared. He was something far more complex, more tragic, a son forced into a fight against his father's world to protect his mother's people. She stood up, her decision made. The fear was still there, but it was overshadowed by a powerful, unexpected surge of conviction. She had walked west to escape the complications of men, but she had stumbled into the heart of a conflict that was as old as the land itself. She bent down and picked up the bag of supplies. She walked over to Caleb and handed him the canteen. Here she said, her voice steady. "You'll need your strength." He looked at her, his hazel eyes wide with surprise and a dawning fragile hope. You're not leaving Alara." Vance looked back the way they had come at the shimmering heat haze of the deep desert, and then ahead toward the town of redemption and the gallows that surely awaited him. She had chosen to keep him on the side of the living once. She found to her own astonishment that she was not yet willing to let him cross that line. "No, Caleb," she said, meeting his gaze. "We're not done walking yet." Sheriff Jedediah Kane stood on the porch of his office, the batwing doors behind him swinging softly in the evening breeze. The town of Redemption was settling down for the night, its lamplight spilling onto the dusty main street in warm golden rectangles. To most, he was the very picture of Western authority, tall and broad-shouldered, with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite, and a thick graying moustache that concealed the grim set of his mouth. The silver star pinned to his leather vest glinted in the fading light. It felt heavier tonight than it ever had before. He held a worn wooden bird in his hand, a crudely carved hawk. Caleb had made it for him when he was 7, hacking away at a piece of scrap wood with a new pocket knife. Jedediah had kept it on his desk for nearly 20 years. It was a reminder of the boy, of the promise he had made to a dying woman in the snow so long ago, a promise to protect her son. Now his own hand had signed the warrant that had put a price on that boy's head. His deputy, a wiry, ambitious man named Alistair Finch, stepped out of the office. Any word Sheriff Jedediah slipped the wooden hawk into his pocket. Just the wire from Tucson. The posse Silas Croft raised is already sweeping north of the Gila, a bunch of trigger-happy gunslicks looking for an excuse to earn $500. He spat onto the dusty street. Croft's leading them himself. Says he's doing his civic duty. "Croft's only duty is to his own wallet," Finch said with a cynical smirk. "He knows if Caleb's out of the way, those Lakota won't have a voice. He can claim their land for pennies on the dollar." Jedediah gave his deputy a sharp look. Finch was smart, sometimes too smart for his own good. But he was right. This was never about a dead deputy. It was about land and water and greed, and his son was caught in the middle of it. His son. The words were a constant ache in his chest. He remembered teaching Caleb to track, watching with pride, as the boy's innate Lakota skills blended with the tracking techniques Jedediah had learned as a young ranger. He remembered the arguments, the boy's quiet fury at the injustices. He saw the growing chasm between them, the lawman and the warrior. "I taught him to stand up for those who can't stand for themselves." Jedediah muttered more to himself than to Finch. Didn't figure he'd take the lesson so damn seriously. A rider galloped into town, pulling his lathered horse to a stop in front of the office. It was a scout from one of the southern patrols. "Sheriff, we got word from Eli Patterson, the trader out at Agua, Dulce." Jedediah's heart leapt into his throat. "Go on." "A woman came in this afternoon, bought supplies, bandages, said her brother was hurt up in the hills, but Eli said she looked like she'd been through a war. After she left, he found tracks nearby, one set of a woman's boots and another of a man's moccasins dragging his feet. He's sure it was Caleb Kane." Finch stepped forward, his eyes alight with excitement. "Agua Dulce. That's only a day's ride from here. We can have a posse ready in an hour." Jedediah held up a hand, his mind racing. Croft's posse was to the south. If Jedediah rode hard for Agua Dulce, He could get there first. He could find Caleb, talk to him, bring him in alive. It was the only chance the boy had. A trial was a slim hope, but it was better than a bullet from one of Croft's hired guns. "No posse," Jedediah said, his voice a low command. "This is my son, my responsibility. I'm going alone." "Sheriff, that's suicide," Finch protested. "He killed a deputy. He won't hesitate to—" "He won't shoot his father," Jedediah cut in with more conviction than he felt. He looked Finch square in the eye. "Your job is to stay here. I want you to send a wire to Silas Croft. Tell him we have a confirmed sighting way out west near the Yuma crossing. Tell him I'm heading there now. I want you to send him on a wild goose chase. Buy me time. Do you understand?" Finch's ambitious eyes narrowed for a fraction of a second, a flicker of calculation that Jedediah didn't miss. But he nodded obediently. "Understood, Sheriff. I'll send him so far west he'll be shaking hands with the Pacific. You be careful." Jedediah nodded, already turning toward the livery. He didn't trust Finch completely. The man's loyalty was to the badge, not to the man wearing it. But he had to take the chance. As he saddled his horse, a powerful buckskin named Judge, his mind was a battlefield. The sheriff in him knew what had to be done. Caleb had broken the law. He had taken a life. He had to be arrested and tried. Justice had to be served. But the father in him screamed in protest. He knew the boy's heart. He knew the rage and the pain that had been building in him for years. He knew about Miller, about Croft, about the slow grinding injustice that his law was powerless to stop. He was hunting his son for committing an act of justice the law itself had failed to deliver. The irony was a bitter pill. He swung himself into the saddle, the familiar creak of leather a small comfort. He pulled the brim of his hat low and spurred Judge out of town, heading south toward Agua Dulce. He rode not as a sheriff leading a posse, but as a father in a desperate race. A race against Silas Croft's gunmen, against the unforgiving territory, and against the terrible unbending law that was etched onto the silver star over his own breaking heart. He had to find Caleb first. He had to, because he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that if Croft's posse found his son, there would be no arrest. There would only be a lonely grave in the desert. With the truth laid bare between them, the dynamic of their journey shifted again. The caution was still there, a constant shadow, but it was now laced with a shared purpose. Ilara was no longer just a savior. She was a conspirator. Caleb was no longer just a patient. He was a man with a mission. "Silas Croft won't stop with Miller's death," Caleb explained, as they made a cold camp in a rocky wash. "He'll use it. He'll paint me as a savage, a leader of an uprising. It's the excuse he needs to get the territorial government to step in and move my people off their land. For good." "So what's your plan?" Ilara asked, dressing his wound with the fresh bandages from Agua Dulce. It was healing remarkably well, a testament to his strength and her care. "There's a man in redemption," Caleb said. "His name is Judge Bryan, magistrate for the whole county. He's old stubborn, and one of the few men my father truly respects. Most importantly, he despises Silas Croft. I have evidence. A ledger I took from Miller's saddlebag before I left him. It details payments from Croft to Miller dates amounts. It proves Miller was nothing but Croft's hired thug." He pulled a thin oilskin-wrapped book from a hidden pocket inside his buckskin trousers. "If I can get this to Judge Porter, it might not save me, but it could expose Croft and protect my people." "And how do you plan to get into redemption and see a judge when the whole town is looking for you?" Ilara countered the practicalities of the situation, crashing down on her. "I don't know," Caleb admitted, the frustration evident in his voice. "But it's the only chance we have." Their journey took on a new urgency. They traveled by night, using the moon and stars as their guide, resting during the day in hidden arroyos and dense thickets. Caleb's strength was returning with every passing hour. He taught Elara how to move silently, how to read the signs of the trail, how to distinguish the dust of a lone rider from that of a posse. She was a quick study, her botanist's eye for detail, translating well to the art of survival. 2 days after leaving Agua Dulce, they saw it, the posse. They were crested on a ridge, their silhouettes dark against the morning sky. There were at least a dozen men, led by a large figure on a powerful black horse. Croft Caleb breathed, pulling Elara down behind a cluster of boulders. "That's his horse, Beelzebub. He's cut us off. My father must not have gotten to us first." They watched as the posse fanned out, their movements professional and predatory. They were sweeping the area, leaving no stone unturned. Elara's heart pounded. These were not lawmen. They were hunters, and Caleb was their prey. "We can't outrun them," Elara whispered, her mind racing. "They're on horseback." Caleb's eyes scanned the terrain. "But we can outthink them. They expect us to stay in the broken country, to hide. So we'll do the opposite." He pointed towards a long, shallow canyon that wound its way northeast. "That canyon leads to the old mission San Gregorio. It's abandoned, but it's only a few miles from Redemption. If we can get there, we can wait for nightfall and try to slip into town." It was a desperate gamble. The canyon offered little cover, and if the posse spotted them, they would be trapped. But staying put was a death sentence. The race was on. They moved as fast as they could, Caleb's limp, a painful rhythmic reminder of the bullet that had started it all. The sun was relentless. The air was still and thick with tension. Every snap of a twig, every cry of a hawk sent a jolt of fear through Elara. They could hear the posse behind them, now the shouts of men, the jingle of harnesses. The hunters were closing in. Just as they neared the mouth of the canyon that led to the mission, a rider appeared on the ridge directly above them. He wasn't one of Croft's men. He was alone, on a powerful buckskin horse, a silver star glinting on his chest. Father Caleb gasped, pulling Elara into the shadows of the canyon wall. Sheriff Jedediah Kane sat on his horse, his face a mask of grim determination. He wasn't looking at them. He was looking back in the direction of the approaching posse. He raised his rifle and fired a single shot into the air. The posse's shouts changed in tone. They were converging on the sound of the shot. Jedediah had seen them. He had seen the posse closing in on the canyon, and he was deliberately drawing them away, creating a diversion. He was risking his own life to give his son a chance to escape. It was the act of a father, not a sheriff. "He's buying us time," Caleb said, his voice thick with emotion. "We have to go. Now." They plunged into the relative safety of the canyon, their feet slipping on the loose shale. Behind them, they could hear the angry shouts of Croft as his posse was intercepted by the sheriff. The sounds grew fainter as they pushed deeper into the winding stone corridor. They reached the ruins of the old San Gregorio mission just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The adobe walls were crumbling, the roof of the main chapel, long gone open to the sky. It was a place of ghosts, silent and watchful. They found shelter in the old bell tower, a defensible position with a commanding view of the surrounding countryside. From their vantage point, they could see the distant lights of Redemption begin to flicker on as dusk settled. It looked peaceful, an island of civilization in the vast wilderness. But for them it was the final battleground. Elara watched Caleb's face in the fading light. The conflict, the pain, the love for the father, who was both his hunter and his savior. It was all there. "He loves you," she said softly. "I know," Caleb replied, his gaze fixed on the town. "That's what makes this so hard." The brief respite was shattered by the sound of approaching horses. But it wasn't the full posse. It was 3 riders moving fast and purposefully toward the mission. As they drew closer, Caleb's body went rigid. Croft, he hissed, and 2 of his men, and Finch, my father's deputy. Silas Croft, along with Deputy Finch and another hired gun, had broken off from the main group. Finch must have told them where to look. The deputy had betrayed his sheriff. They were trapped. The race was over. The reckoning was about to begin here, among the ruins of a forgotten faith. The 3 riders dismounted at the entrance to the mission, ruins their boots crunching on the gravel. Silas Croft was a mountain of a man with a florid face and eyes like chips of cold blue ice. Deputy Finch looked nervous, his hand hovering near his pistol. "He's in here, I tell you," Finch said, his voice a reedy whine. "The sheriff as good as told me this is where he'd run. For your sake, deputy. I hope you're right," Croft growled, pulling a massive dragoon revolver from his holster. "The sheriff sent us on a fool's errand. I don't appreciate being made a fool of." Inside the bell tower, Caleb checked his Colt peacemaker. He had 5 rounds. He looked at Elara, his eyes dark with grim resolve. "Stay here, no matter what you hear." "Like hell I will," she shot back, her fear forged into a steely anger. She held up the heavy rock she'd picked up. "I didn't drag you across 100 miles of desert to watch you die now." A flicker of a smile touched Caleb's lips. "Spirit of a bison," he murmured. "Caleb Kane," Croft's voice boomed through the ruins, echoing off the crumbling adobe walls. "Come on out, boy. Your father isn't here to protect you now. Let's finish this." Caleb took a deep breath. This was never about the law, he called down, his voice clear and steady. "This was about you stealing land, Croft. And Miller was your dog." "Miller was a sworn deputy," Finch shouted. "You murdered him, I have proof," Caleb yelled back, holding up the oilskin-wrapped ledger. "A ledger. With all of Croft's payments to him. I'm taking it to Judge Porter." This gave Croft and Finch pause. Elara could see them exchange a worried glance. The ledger changed everything. This was no longer just about silencing an outlaw. It was about destroying evidence. "There's 2 of us and 3 of them," Elara whispered. "The odds aren't good." "The odds have never been good," Caleb replied. He looked around the bell tower. At the top, hanging precariously from a rotten beam, was the mission's old bronze bell. An idea sparked in his eyes. "Distraction," he whispered to her. Before she could ask what he meant, he burst from the cover of the tower, firing a single shot over the heads of the men below. As they dove for cover, firing wildly back at him, Caleb scrambled up the inside of the tower wall, using the crumbling masonry as handholds. Elara understood. While they were focused on Caleb, she was the distraction. She ran from the tower's base, heading for the collapsed wall of the main chapel, the rock held high. Croft saw her. "The woman! Get her!" he roared. The 3rd gunman, a lanky man with a cruel sneer, turned his attention to Elara, leveling his pistol. At that exact moment, a thunderous bong reverberated through the mission. Caleb had reached the top and thrown his full weight against the massive bell. It swung wildly, its deep, resonant toll shaking the very foundations of the tower. The gunman flinched, startled by the sudden deafening noise. It was the only opening Elara needed. She threw the rock with all her might. It caught the man square in the temple. He crumpled to the ground unconscious. Bong. The bell rang out again. Finch rattled, fired up at the bell tower, his shots going wide. From the other side of the courtyard, another shot rang out, but this one was different. It was the heavy, authoritative boom of a rifle. Deputy Finch cried out and grabbed his shoulder, his pistol clattering to the ground. Sheriff Jedediah Kane stood at the mission entrance, his rifle smoking his face, a mask of cold fury. "Drop it, Croft," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. "It's over." Silas Croft stared at the sheriff, then at the wounded Finch, then at the ledger, still clutched in Caleb's hand as he slid down from the tower. A cornered animal was never more dangerous. With a roar of pure rage, Croft turned and fired not at Caleb, but at Jedediah. Father Caleb screamed. Everything seemed to happen in slow motion. Jedediah staggered back, a dark stain blossoming on his chest. But even as he fell, his lawman's instincts took over. He raised his own pistol and fired. The shot was true. Croft was thrown backward, his life ending in the dust of the holy ground he had desecrated. Elara and Caleb rushed to Jedediah's side. The sheriff was dying, his breathing shallow and ragged. He looked up at his son, his eyes full of a lifetime of love and regret. "The ledger!" he gasped. "I have it," Father Caleb said, his voice breaking as he knelt, holding his father's hand. "Good," Jedediah whispered. "Clear your name. Live. Be the bridge, son. Be the man I always knew you were." He squeezed Caleb's hand one last time, and then the light faded from his eyes. The Sheriff of Redemption was dead, killed protecting his outlaw son. The aftermath was quiet. The main posse arrived to a scene of carnage and confusion. Deputy Finch, clutching his wounded shoulder, confessed everything implicating Croft and corroborating Caleb's story. The ledger was the final nail in the coffin. In the end, the official story was that Sheriff Kane had heroically tracked down the true villain, Silas Croft, and in the ensuing gunfight, both men had fallen. Caleb Kane, it was determined, had acted in self-defense against a corrupt deputy. Judge Porter, after reviewing the ledger and hearing Finch's testimony, quietly dropped all charges. Caleb was a free man, but he had lost his father. Elara stood with him as they buried Jedediah on a hill overlooking the town he had served for 30 years. A week later they stood on that same hill, 2 horses saddled behind them. "What will you do now?" Elara asked. "My father asked me to be a bridge," Caleb said, looking toward the lands of the Lakota. "I spent my whole life fighting that. Now, I think I'm finally ready to be one. Not for him or for them. For me." He turned to her, his hazel eyes searching hers. "What about you? Back to St. Louis?" Elara thought of the ash and the ghosts she had left behind. Then she thought of the desert of the ordeal that had nearly killed her, but had also made her feel more alive than she ever had before. She thought of the man standing beside her. "No," she said, a small, genuine smile gracing her lips for the first time in over a year. "I think my solitude is over." "I've heard Oregon is beautiful this time of year." Caleb's returning smile was like the sun breaking through the clouds. He offered her his hand. Without hesitation, she took it. Together they turned away from the town of Redemption and rode west, not as a white woman and a Lakota outlaw, but as 2 survivors who had found their own unlikely redemption in the heart of the burning desert. And so the story of Elara Vance and Caleb Kane comes to a close. It's a tale that reminds us that the line between outlaw and hero is sometimes drawn in the sand, easily blurred by the winds of greed and injustice. It's a story of profound sacrifice, of a father who laid down his life so his son could truly live, breaking his own sacred law to uphold a higher one. Elara and Caleb didn't just survive the desert. They were reforged by it. They walked through the fire of the past and found not an escape, but a new beginning together. Their journey reminds us that sometimes the family you choose is forged in the harshest of trials, and that true justice isn't always found in a courtroom, but in the courage of a human heart. What did you think of their story? Who was the true hero in this tale? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of the Old West moved you, please hit that like button, share it with someone who loves a good Western drama, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel for more true-life tales from the dust and glory of the American frontier. Thanks for listening.